Recognizing that in a lot of ways, grief is seen as such a taboo topic. We don't want to talk about it. We don't like talking about death, dying, loss, you name it, anything in that category. We
Mhm.
oftentimes are given a cold shoulder when we bring up that conversation.
Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome back to another episode. I am so grateful to be with you all today. And today we are having a very important conversation with a very important guest. And this sister, I met her at the Black Woman Leading Conference this year. And I just it was love at first sight. She is super powerful. We connected instantly and I can't wait to have this conversation with her today. So, Dr. Chinasa Elue, she is an award winning professor, speaker, grief coach, and the CEO and founder of True Titans Consulting Group. Her work focuses on the ways in which we cultivate spaces in society to have authentic conversations about grief in an effort to provide more holistic grief support. She offers grief coaching to support individuals who have experienced grief and loss of all kinds and moving forward with empathy and care. And she is also an associate professor of educational leadership in higher education. And so I am so excited, so grateful to have you, Dr. Chinasa. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's an absolute joy to be here with you and to talk with your audience as well.
Yes. So I do like for my audience to get to know my guests a little bit. So would you mind just sharing a little about who you are, how you came into this work, and how you came to start your company?
Absolutely. So, again, Dr. Chinasa Elue. I'm based out of the Metro Atlanta area. And it's always interesting. We hear this question when we're growing up: what do you want to be when you grow up? And no one necessarily grows up and says, hey, I want to be a grief coach. But in a lot of ways, life happens and we find ourselves searching for deeper meaning. And that's exactly what happened to me. In 2019, I lost my mom to cancer. Losing her absolutely devastated me in ways that words honestly cannot describe. But it was 9 months before the pandemic. And what was interesting during this time frame was after she passed away, I began to really think about how I was going to cope with the gravity of this loss. And then we're thrust into the pandemic, and there's this collective sense of grief. We're grieving
Mhm.
a lack of normalcy, grieving the state of affairs of the world because there was so much that was unraveling before our very eyes.
Yeah.
And I remember being in that moment, just navigating my own personal grief journey, just wondering what would it look like to even be able to navigate this thing? Like, how would I ever be normal again? Would I ever feel like I'm grounded in a way? And
Mhm.
it took some time, but a part of me moving into this work was me being able to identify meaningful strategies to help me cope. And then
Mhm.
recognizing that in a lot of ways, grief is seen as such a taboo topic. We don't want to talk about it. We don't like talking about death, dying, loss, you name it, anything in that category. We
Yeah.
oftentimes are given a cold shoulder when we bring up that conversation.
Mhm.
And I knew I wanted to engage more intentionally around grief work. And so I began that journey from that experience.
Wow, it's powerful. Well, first of all, I'm sorry for the loss of your mother. I know that. I mean, I can only imagine,
Yeah.
how that must be. And you know, what I'm grateful for is that it inspired you to do this work because it is so needed, as you said.
Yeah.
And when we talk about grief, I mean, first of all, I don't think the world has stopped grieving since the pandemic. Let's just name it. And if anything, it's gotten worse. And we've seen even the impact, the devolution since the pandemic. So I feel like we as a nation have, and maybe as a world even, have not recovered. And I 100% agree with you. Like people avoid grief at all costs.
Yes.
Like I don't have time to grieve. I don't have time to feel. I don't have time to die. I got to get stuff done. And at least in my experience, my limited experience in coaching, one of the things that I often hear, and I imagine you hear this too, is like there's a fear of allowing in the grief
Yes.
for fear of it will completely incapacitate a person and
Yes.
they have things to do. Like I can't afford to be incapacitated. Is that something that you see?
Uh, Yes, 1,000% yes. When you mentioned this notion around no time to grieve, I think that is oftentimes one of the biggest challenges that we face because the reality is particularly with the loss of a loved one, once we bury them or have our final services for those near and dear to us, we often find that the world has gone back to normal. People are
Mhm,
back to their regularly scheduled program, and we are left reeling and wondering, how in the world do I pick up the pieces and move on from here?
mhm,
And we somehow, some way, haphazardly kind of piece things together, even though we know our executive functioning skills are low, even though we know we're not able to function, and we have a deep void that is very present for us. And so, what I often hear is just this lack of time. And when there are opportunities or particular triggers that happen, maybe there's a particular song that comes up, or
mhm,
a birthday's around the corner and you're navigating the absence of their presence,
mhm,
those are pockets where people will take the time to grieve. But
mhm,
more holistically, is this fear of being broken down so bad that they will not be able to recover and be able to pick things up and keep going again, because the pain of it all is too
mhm.
much to handle. And I think
Right.
oftentimes that is a fear for why sometimes we suppress feelings around grief or the emotions that come up when we even think about just allowing ourselves to cry and begin to process
Yeah,
the pain of it
yeah,
all. Yeah.
absolutely. One of the things that, I have contemplated and had discussions about, and even I think we've had discussions about, in other conversations, is this notion that this sort of limited notion that grief is only surrounding death.
Yes.
And we know very well that loss happens in all kinds of forms, all kinds of forms. And we're seeing it now with the layoffs,
Mhm.
that are happening, but also like divorce
Yes.
being a loss, or even when grieving when a child moves away from home, because that's a big transition.
Mhm.
Or, I recently had a colleague who was diagnosed with cancer and went
Mhm.
through her recovery process. And
Mm.
so even that, like having to have a hysterectomy for
Yes.
a woman is one thing.
Mhm.
And so like these types of things, are having to have a mastectomy for a woman.
Mhm.
These are things that people don't think about as times to grieve.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's such an important point, right? That we don't just grieve loved ones, we grieve a lot of different things. And we don't, sometimes we lack the language or the awareness to really name what it is that we're walking through. To
Mhm.
your point, oftentimes I hear about career related grief where if it was an involuntary layoff, right, you were let go from your organization, grieving the very essence of a career that you may have held down the fort for so long, right? We're seeing massive layoffs right now. And there's a lot of grief around what does it mean when I've devoted all these number of years to a job and I'm no longer needed? The loss of colleagues, the loss of connections, the networks, the work itself,
Mhm.
that gives us a sense of identity. And so we may be grieving a person we once were in that context because our identities are so interlaced with the work that we do. To your point, divorce, I see a lot of grief around friendships as we get older and are evolving as people. There may be friendships that no longer serve us in real time. And what does it mean to grieve those
Yeah.
relationships? It happens. Family members, family connections,
Yeah.
grieving sibling dynamics that you didn't imagine for yourself. Maybe you thought you would be closer as you aged and
Mhm.
found that due to life circumstances, you're no longer as close as you once were, right? And you grieve the very essence of what may no longer be present for you in the future.
Yeah.
Animals, when we lose pets,
That's
people
right.
grieve deeply. When people retire, there's grief.
Yes.
I say all these different examples to really highlight for us the many ways that grief shows up in life, right? And that it's not just confined to the loss of a loved one, but it really is open to the various lived experiences we find ourselves encountering along our life's journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to underline, as we talk about even this space of layoffs, the people who are left behind.
Mm,
And because oftentimes those people are left reeling and feeling what they're feeling, their emotions,
yeah.
and may have the conversation, well, I'm not the one who got fired, so why should I feel sad? But it's that like the grief of the loss of that person and maybe even the suddenness of it,
Yes.
right? And so, just like that piece, I think is also important to recognize.
Mhm.
And then the other piece that often people don't think about that I actually myself wasn't super present to until maybe the last 5 years is the vicarious grief.
Mm.
That grief when someone, and maybe someone you don't know, but
Mhm.
say someone that's maybe well known. And I'm going to give an example, Malcolm Jamal Warner. There was a deep sense of
Yes.
loss and grief in the
Yes.
community. And I personally was like so very knocked off center because of who he represented and who he was,
Mm.
right? So that, like that sort of vicarious when Twitch died,
Yes.
few years ago. And so I think that these are some maybe what might people say outliers that people don't always think about
Yeah.
that impact us and can cause that sort of vicarious grief as well.
Yes. I think that's such an important piece you're mentioning there. To your point, yes, when Malcolm Jamal Warner passed away, it was just like a deep mourning because, in a way, I felt like I knew him, even though I never did in real life, right? But it was a part of my childhood. He
Mhm.
was so interlaced with my childhood in terms of the TV shows he starred on.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times we experience some of that vicarious grief, some of that parasocial grief from celebrities and other public figures that we may not have known.
Yeah.
That when they pass away, it really impacts us in ways we didn't expect. Right? I think about that for Kobe Bryant. Didn't know
Yes.
him personally, but
Right.
the nature in which it happened. I think it was a year after my mom passed. It was all of the things, and then
Yeah.
with the pandemic, I
Yes.
think that really was like just a very devastating thing to hear in that context and time.
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, and even, that grief can persist because even now, if I see videos of Kobe Bryant and his
Yes.
daughter, I still get very sad, or even,
Mhm.
still because it's actually very recent when, I see videos of Malcolm Jamal Warner, it
Yes.
kinda, like, shocks me back into the realization, like, "Oh,
Mhm.
wait." So, yeah, I
Mhm.
appreciate you bringing that to the forefront as well.
Mhm.
One of the things that so given all of that, right? Like
Mhm.
given that there's all these so many ways that people can grieve. And we've talked about the fact that people oftentimes want to avoid that grief. And then there's the people who are like witnessing the grieving that don't know what to do or what to say about it. And then if you're in an organization who may or may not give space for that grief.
Yes.
Yeah. So I want to start with, because I want to touch on both of those things, but I want to start with the people who don't know what to do with other people's grief.
Yes. I think that's such a big piece because particularly if you are in a supportive role, if someone has lost someone and you're showing up and you care for them, and you want to just be present, I think the biggest thing we have to realize, particularly when people lose loved ones, is that there really are no words you can offer to comfort someone. I
That's right.
think sometimes we're always left with these high platitudes. Oh, they're in a better place, or they're not suffering anymore. People don't want to hear that, y'all.
Right.
I mean, they really don't
Right.
want to hear that. The reality is, it's painful. And
Mhm.
so I think the best things that we can do at times, if you're in a position to support someone, is to simply just be there. Be there and be present. Know that your presence is enough. Hold a hand, cover them gently with a blanket if need be, and come bearing gifts of some kind, right? Their favorite cup of tea or some tea bags. If you happen to stop by their home and you notice things are a little disarray, ask for permission, but help tidy up, right?
Mhm.
Sometimes, especially when you literally you kind of shut down a lot when you are grieving. So the
Mhm.
things that you normally would attend to kind of go out the window. And so if you're a
Mhm.
friend that's coming over to support, I think the biggest thing is to really read between the lines and listen in that context and see what can you do to provide support and do just that. The platitudes don't really mean much. Just let them know I love you, I care, I'm here. Whatever you want to share, I'm here to listen. If they're like, I just want you to hold my hand, just hold their hand and be there.
Yeah, yeah. I think oftentimes for those people who, and admittedly, I used to be one of those people, right?
Same.
For those people who don't know what to do, it's you're dealing with your own discomfort.
Yeah.
And we have to put aside our own discomfort to really look at, okay, what is it that they might need? And so I think that's important for those who are sitting beside and supporting those who are in grief. we're going to feel that same discomfort because it's the discomfort of knowing that there's nothing you can do to make it better.
Um,
And we are, when we are in a position where we love someone, we want to make it better. But like you said earlier, like there's nothing you can say or do that makes that circumstance better.
yeah.
And so we have to sit with that discomfort and just be with and support the person in the way that they need. And I
Mhm.
love when you say, cleaning up house, maybe bringing food or bringing them tea. Those are the types of things that, in the long run, especially after, like you said, the services are done and people have gone on with their lives, but this person is still reeling, that we can do is continually support them to bring them through, checking in on them and just coming by and saying,
Yes.
hey, you mind if I hang out with you for a little bit? Is there a TV show that you watch?
Mhm.
Whatever, right? So those are the types of things that, like, I'm hearing you,
Yeah.
as you talk about, that I'm hearing you bring forward.
I love that you mentioned that because I think, to your point, after the services, people go back to business as normal.
Mhm,
And I think there's an intentionality that's required, especially that first year after the loss, to
mhm,
perhaps think about what are the milestones that are going to happen and how can I continue to support? Maybe during the holidays, reach out to them. Hey, I'm thinking of you. If it was a
mhm,
parent that they lost, if it's Mother's Day, Father's Day, whatever that be, hey, I know it's your first Mother's Day without your mom, right? Or your dad. Thinking of
mhm,
you today, sending flowers, sending a bouquet.
mhm,
Those little measures go a long way, because I think the biggest challenge at times is people are afraid that people will forget the one that they lost. And to
mhm,
know that someone is tracking along their grief journey with them, I think speaks volumes when we're thinking about ways to continue to support.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, coming even back to that bigger picture of this collective grief that we're experiencing, one of the things I'm curious about is how organizations can create space for grief to happen, and whether it's, an organization or like teams,
Mhm.
leaders on teams can
Yeah.
create those spaces for grief. Like, where do you feel gives can give an access for that to happen?
I think a big piece with organizations is that, again, to this notion that grief is often seen as taboo, I think we need to really humanize our lived experiences. The reality is, in our organizations, as we speak, there are people who are walking through grief
Yeah,
of all kinds, right?
absolutely.
And I think we need to just, one, acknowledge that that exists. That is the
Mhm,
context in which we operate. There was a study I saw not too long ago, and I don't have the exact quote off head, but I believe grief costs organizations $75 billion dollars a year in lost productivity, wages, and other services, right? So when you think about that particular number, it lets you know right now that, and I hate to take it to money, but I know we
yeah,
live in a capitalistic
yeah,
society. If I were going to make a point here, let me use the money to drive it home.
that's right.
We need to be intentional about the types of grief support that we provide, right?
Yeah,
So I know oftentimes, if it's the loss of a loved one, or some form of bereavement, if someone miscarried, or things of that capacity, we
mhm,
oftentimes refer employees to EAPs, right? To go to your
mhm,
employee assistance program and, reach out to a counselor, someone to support. And that's, intended to be a private resource for you to leverage, right?
yeah,
But I think there are some bigger things that leaders particularly can do. If someone is emerging back into the workplace after having some form of loss, I think we have to be intentional about how do we ensure that they have a soft landing when they return, and what
mhm,
might that look like? And I think that's going to take some innovation and creativity, especially in light of organizational policies, because I think
mhm,
policies sometimes restricts what we're able to offer those who need more than just sometimes the customary 3 days, which is just the services, but
mm,
none of the aftermath that comes on the back end, right?
yeah,
And so I think thinking about workload accommodations is key. I
mm,
think that is absolutely necessary, recognizing that when people come back, again, their executive functioning is low. And
yeah,
so if they need a little bit of grace, or if they need to swap responsibilities with someone else, being open to that,
yeah,
be willing to, ask gently, hey, what do you need? And be and listening to them, right?
yeah,
And also, again, I keep saying reading the room, but there are things that we can pick up on that we know may be a heavy lift. And I think
mhm,
giving people grace to really make the adjustments they need as they're figuring things out is necessary. And oftentimes we don't afford people that opportunity because they're back and we're like, okay, well, the project deadline is around the corner and we're
Mhm.
expecting them to power through like they were like it is business as normal
Right.
when their entire world is upended. And I think to humanize the grief process is key here,
Mhm.
recognizing that they need more time. And it
Yes.
may not be a month, it may not be 2 months, it may be a year or a couple of years down the road, and they're still showing up and they're having a hard time.
Yep.
And it's acknowledging that this is grief. And
Yeah.
and we're all going to have a different experience, some longer than others in terms of
Mhm.
how we cope, but
Mhm.
making room and space for that is key.
Yeah, that is so, so key. And I love what you talk about work accommodations. One of the things that came up is like graduated return.
Yes.
It's like instead of returning full time, why not return half time and then maybe graduate to three-quarters time?
Yeah.
And then make those, maybe bring in partnerships for responsibilities,
Yeah.
partnered responsibilities. Like I love that idea of work
Yeah.
accommodations because a lot of times people are thrown back into their full-time job,
Mhm.
you know, 3 days later or 1 week later. And then that capacity to do work is just diminished. And
Yes.
then a lot of times then people get punished for that.
Correct.
And
And your
so
reviews could get on a performance improvement plan. I'm like,
right,
how calloused of you, right?
right. They'll
Like,
say things like, "Well, we know that you had a loss recently, but dot dot dot."
correct.
And that's like the worst thing. It's like you just invalidated the entire loss and the grief that comes along with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking about, even we have these like potential policies, and then even like how sometimes when a person comes back to work, people don't know what to say. They tiptoe around them
Yes.
and like handle them with kid gloves, which I think can also be harmful as well. And so, like, I think that in a way, when a person goes back to work, they know they're going back with limited capacity. So there's a balance between accommodations and eggshells, if you
Mhm.
will, right?
Yes.
And so how do we navigate that? How do their immediate colleagues navigate that? You
Yeah.
know,
I think a lot of this is gonna depend on a couple of things, I'll just be honest. I think the relationships that we have within the
that's right.
workplace, right? It's not everybody that you want coming to ask you, "Hey, how's it going? I heard you lost
That's
someone."
right.
Because the relationship may not have been there beforehand. Maybe we're on a professional need to know only basis, and then you coming to me is not really comforting. Fine and have a good day. But depending on the relationship, especially if this is a close colleague you've worked with for a number of years, I think not glossing over, taking the time to just say, "Hey, how are you coping? How's it going?" Checking in. I always share this story how when I lost my mom, how my colleagues that I work with were so intentional about the care and support they provided. And in a lot of ways, that's an anomaly because I don't hear this experience oftentimes with people I coach. But I think what made it so intentional was, not only did they say send like the flowers, right, and check in, but they made it a point to come to the services, right? They made it a point when I came back to ask me what I needed, provide support with some workplace responsibilities, right?
Mhm.
Recognizing that she'll be back, but she's not 100% back. And so
Right.
it was such a caring experience. I feel like I had white glove service coming back because they were so caring. And,
Yeah.
and that always sticks with me with just how they navigated me and how I really want to encourage folks to really show up for those in their workplaces that are grieving. Handle them with care.
Yeah.
The goal should be to do as little harm as possible. And so
Mhm.
if your colleague feels like talking about if you're someone they trust and they want to share a memory with you, maybe something comes up for them, be
Mhm.
willing to listen if you have capacity, right? I think,
Mhm.
if you catch them and they're crying or something sets them off, right? Because that happens. There were times I would be in meetings and someone would say something about a context, and it would just trigger a memory, and I might start tearing up a little bit. Um,
Mhm.
hold space for that. Say, "Hey,
Yeah.
are you okay?" Grab them a tissue. Don't make a scene about it. But I think,
Mhm.
again, just acknowledging that we're all human. And the unfortunate thing is that we will all walk through some form of loss in this lifetime. Nobody leaves here unscathed. Like we will all experience grief and not just once, many times over,
Mhm.
unfortunately. And we have to begin to humanize this very much so lived experience that we all will have.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
As we've talked about a lot of things as we begin to bring it full circle, one of the things that has come up is this idea of recognizing grief, because we don't know
Yeah.
what everybody's going through. People, like you said, in organizations, they are walking with grief every single day. And it might be grief of a personal nature, or it might be grief of a global nature. So, what are some of the ways that, like behaviorally, we can start to recognize that the way a person is communicating, or the way they may be behaving, or maybe even withdrawing, could be related to grief?
Yeah. I don't know if there's necessarily a telltale formula, right? But I think a big piece of this is going to be communication and
Mhm.
picking up on some subtle cues.
Yeah.
I oftentimes think about those things that are kind of first on the list, right? How are people presenting when they show up in the workplace?
Mhm.
Sometimes it may be anger, right?
Mhm.
Because grief does present as anger at
Yeah.
times, and how people may have once been more level-headed and cool. Now you're seeing more aggression or more anger behind their response, or how they're communicating with you or other stakeholders. That may be a piece of it, and maybe some just general frustration in general, given the context, right? I think withdrawal symptoms, right? Not as engaged, not as forthcoming with just details, maybe dropping the ball. You'll notice certain things that probably were once sharp on, but then start to decline as they
Mhm.
move ahead. Just seeming distracted, maybe camera off if you're in a virtual setting, not easy to reach via phone or email, not responsive. I think that
Mhm.
those communication pieces are like, okay, something going on. And then taking
Mhm.
the necessary time to probe a little bit further. Say, hey, can we chat? I notice, some things are going on here. Is there anything I can do to support, right? People
Mhm.
may not feel comfortable to disclose. I'm just gonna be honest, is work,
Yeah.
right? I think depending on the nature of the relationship, again, you may get some intel that gives you some light that they are experiencing a loss. And I've
Mhm.
also noticed, like, not only just loss, but some anticipatory grief as well,
Mhm.
especially if you're in the place where you have young children or family members at home, but you're caretaking for elderly loved ones or
Yeah.
community members. Being stuck in that messy middle at times
Mhm.
can really do a number and really stretch us thin. And so I think being able to pick up on those subtle cues too is necessary, but you'll only probably get that information through communication.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think what you said is just so key, that it's not a formula,
Mhm.
and that we have to be watching and listening and be engaged with people in order to know when those shifts happen, and
Yes.
when they're happening and they're happening consistently, because some people will have bad days. But if something you notice, like a trend is starting to a trend, a shift in behavior or communication, that could be something to be like, hey, I'm just checking in. Can I support you in any way? Like you said, people may not want to disclose. I think as important as recognizing grief in another is recognizing grief in ourselves,
Right.
especially when we haven't experienced one of the, um, what the typical definition, what most people think about when they think about
Mhm.
grief. Just sort of recognizing, our own feelings of sadness, or our own feeling disengaged, or feeling like we're noticing whether we're isolating, noticing if we're having sleep disturbances, noticing our own responses, but particularly in our body, like
Yeah.
noticing what it feels like in our body. Because I think that oftentimes our body feels things that our brain can't always put a finger on and label. And so just like listening to our body,
Mm.
and then honoring that, and then hopefully we have access to, or we can find a safe space
Yeah.
to just say, hey, I'm not okay.
Yes. I think we gotta do that more often though, right?
Yeah.
Especially I think about this current state of how we're just navigating the context in the world, and I think a lot of what we are walking through is grief. Outside of losing loved ones, I just think about just, again, grieving multiple things at the same time. It's almost like an onslaught
Yeah.
to the point where we're looking for some form of reprieve. And I think to your point, we have to be intentional about getting to a place where one, we can communicate effectively that we need some additional support, and
Mhm.
asking ourselves what does that support need to look like at this current moment in time.
Mhm.
And then two, also thinking about how do we interface some moments of joy even
Yeah.
as we navigate grief.
Yes.
Because, I think both can coexist, right? Just
Mhm.
because, I'm having a great moment here doesn't mean that the grief is just faded away. It just means I'm giving myself the grace and the time to experience a joyous moment that is so necessary and needed in real time. And
Yeah.
so how do we find room for both, and allowing both to coexist in this space as we navigate our day-to-day context is key.
And I think it's important for us to recognize that even when we are going through grief, that it's okay to experience those moments of joy. It doesn't mean that we miss that our person any less. It doesn't mean that that grief is necessarily fading away. It just means we give ourselves permission to experience that joy and that laughter and
Yes.
to celebrate the life in the way we can celebrate it in these moments.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Wow. Wow, this is just such a full conversation and such a beautiful conversation. And I just so appreciate you, Dr. Chinasa, for bringing your expertise, but also just bringing yourself to the conversation, like just your experience. And we talked about so many things, like just from personal grief to societal grief and how you recognize it and how you can support. So, what would be something that you would want if they remembered nothing else for the audience to take away from this
Mm.
conversation about grieving?
I'll say 2 things really quickly that come to mind for me. The first piece is I think the physiological aspects of grief, I think we need to be very intentional about figuring out what we need to support, right?
Mhm,
I say this honestly in thinking about how, oftentimes grief may show up with a lot of anxiety. It
mhm,
may show up with a lot of, to your point, some of those physical markers that our
mhm,
body will begin to alert us that something is off here.
mhm,
And if I could share anything, I would say get some form of physical activity in, right? I
mhm.
know that everyone is not a gym rat here, and I'm not saying you have to be,
Right.
but I will mention that there is something so profound about moving your body and how it
Mhm,
interfaces with grief. And so if you are in a place right now where you're noticing a lack of energy, lack of focus, a lack of concentration, a lot of anxious energy, finding a physical outlet, going for a walk for 10 to 15 minutes a day, finding a great gym community that you can connect with, finding a nice hobby that gets you moving, I think is key here. And then last, I'll just say make the time to grieve, whatever it is, whether it's the loss of a loved one, a career, whatever the case may be. Make the time to do the work so that it doesn't show up in other areas in life. I
yeah.
find that oftentimes when we don't take the time to really anchor ourselves and begin to talk about the very difficult things that we've walked through, it
Mhm,
tends to manifest in other areas, whether it's relationships with loved ones, our friendships, other things tend to suffer how we care for ourselves.
mhm.
And so, not taking the time is a disservice to your future self.
Yeah.
And you deserve the opportunity to understand what does it mean to walk in healing and
Mhm.
how might healing manifest for you if you would take the time to do what's difficult now and
Yeah.
see the fruit of that seed manifest into something great later.
Such beautiful words to
Mhm.
end on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Please let our audience know how they can continue to follow you, to reach out to you, to get in touch with you if they need you.
Absolutely. You can reach me on all social media platforms at Dr. Chinasa Elue. I'm most active on LinkedIn and Instagram, so feel free to reach out to me there or my website, which I'm sure you'll include in the show notes as well.
I absolutely will. I absolutely will. Again, thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you for the audience. Without the audience, there is no podcast. I appreciate you. I appreciate if you would share this episode with a friend, with a family, with a colleague, so that people can really get a sense for how they need to connect with one another through these times of grief. And please leave a review. Leave a review and let us know what your thoughts are on this topic and what you want to hear more about. And so, with that, thank you again so much for being with us
Thank you.
today. I appreciate you. And for the audience, until the next time we see you, stay empowered.